Good evening. Welcome and thanks for coming to the Boston Public Library's Local History Lecture Series. As part of our program, we want to read the following statement to bring attention to the land which we use for our building and events. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the Indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement, which will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, Free to All. This talk is being presented in conjunction with the Partnership of Historic Bostons and will be live streamed and recorded and posted on historicbostons.org and their YouTube channel. Questions will be taken at the end of the lecture. Please wait for the microphones to ask questions so that they can be included in the recording. Tonight, we are very pleased to present a panel discussion on stolen relations, Centuries of Native Enslavement in the Americas, which will be moderated by Laurie Rogers Stokes. Laurie Rogers Stokes, PhD, is an author, independent scholar, and contributing editor with the Boston Congregational Library and Archives on New England's Hidden Histories, covering colonial era church histories. She studies the founding decades of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, during which the forms of church and state were put into place that would shape American history for centuries to come. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Laurie, and welcome. It's so wonderful to gather with you here tonight, in person and in spirit, in this auditorium, and around the world online. We, everyone, all of us at the Partnership of Historic Bostons are so happy that you are able to gather with us here as we continue our fall series on Indigenous enslavement and resistance. And that is a series that is funded in part by a generous grant from Mass Humanities. So we were not all able to travel here to Shawmut tonight, but wherever you are, wherever we are on land that Indigenous people belong to. And I think part of what that means is that whatever we do as historians and citizens and people in relationship with each other, we should work to make sure that it is informed about Indigenous history and presence, and that we are listening to Indigenous people as often as we can. And I'm happy to say that we are doing both of those things here tonight. So the way this is structured is, our first guest of the evening, Dr. Linford Fisher, is going to come up and give a brief presentation. And then he will be joined on stage by the rest of our guests, who I will introduce as they come on stage. So first, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Linford Fisher, Associate Professor of History at Brown University, and the author of The Indian Great Awakening, Religion and the Shaping of Native Cultures in Early America. He's also co-author of Decoding Roger Williams, the lost essay of Rhode Island's founding father. Lynn is the principal investigator of the digital project Stolen Relations, recovering stories of Indigenous enslavement in the Americas. This is a community-centered, collaborative project that seeks to broaden our understanding of Indigenous experiences of settler colonization and its legacies through the lens of slavery and servitude. Lynn is currently finishing another book-length project tentatively titled America Enslaved, Native Slavery in the English Caribbean and the United States, about Native American enslavement in English colonies and later in the United States, from the arrival of Columbus to the American Civil War. So let's welcome Lynn up to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, whether in person or online, and thanks to Historic Boston's and the Boston Public Library for the chance to be here. It really is an impressive lineup of events this fall, and so congratulations. For that, it's an honor to be a part of that lineup as well. Thanks to Lori for the introductions, and to my co-panelists who you will meet in just a few moments, who are also here. So tonight, I and my co-panelists are here to talk about a project that is on a history that is rarely fully understood or discussed, namely the enslavement of Native Americans and the role that such enslavement played in the colonization of lands that the United States now occupies, and how tribal nations today have dealt with this history and other sources of historical trauma over time. So I have a short introduction about the project, a little bit about this history, some of the documents, before I turn to a larger discussion with my co-panelists. So for the past 8 years, I and a small team of researchers at Brown University have been working on a project called Stolen Relations, recovering stories of Indigenous enslavement in the Americas. And in short, it is our goal to recover the stories of enslaved Indigenous people from the archives and present them in a respectful way in a searchable database for the public, for the use of tribal nations and Indigenous peoples for whom this history relates. So since 2019, this has been at the core of the project, has been a series of collaborations with regional Native nations and communities, such as the Chappaquidick Wampanoag, Hassanamisco Nipmuc, and Narragansett nations represented here this evening, and others as well. So you might be asking yourself, was Native enslavement really significant enough to devote a whole entire project and website to? And I and we think so for the following reasons. First, Indigenous slavery was much more prevalent than we have previously realized. And I'm speaking not only of the wider public, but also scholars as well. Indigenous people, of course, know this history. Scholars now estimate there were between 2 and 5.5 million Indigenous peoples enslaved in the Americas as a whole, meaning North, Central, South Americas, and the Caribbean, between 1492 and 1880 and beyond. So 500,000 Indigenous men, women, and children were enslaved in what is now the United States alone. Every American colony, meaning the English colony, and almost every American state after 1776 held and contained Indigenous, enslaved, and unfree people. But I want to be clear, as Lorén Spears has reminded me repeatedly, and I think we'll say again tonight, that not all Native people everywhere were enslaved. It's really important to recognize that as well. In fact, most Indigenous people were not. Still, there is a surprisingly large number of Indigenous nations and people that experience this history. And the public has forgotten, I think, or maybe intentionally forgotten in some cases. Scholars ignored this for decades and decades, if not centuries. And so I think the time has come to make this a little more visible in terms of understanding this history. The second thing is that enslaving Indigenous people started earlier and lasted longer than most people realize. So without at all meaning to diminish the importance and centrality of the African slave trade and the experiences of enslaved African people in the United States over time, it is important also to recognize that Indigenous enslavement was the first and the last slavery as far as how we currently define slavery in American history. It started in 1492 with the arrival of Christopher Columbus. That's when our first document in the database is from, actually. It continued in every era of American history past the American Civil War. And in fact, after the American Civil War in the 1860s, Indigenous people were still being enslaved in the Southwest, especially New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, California. So much so that Congress had to pass a separate act in 1867 to begin to curb and to render illegal, more explicitly, the unfreedom of Indigenous people. And that was 2 years after the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which should have, in theory, ended slavery throughout the United States. So our records in the database so far are up through the early 20th century. But of course, there are other instances later how slavery morphed into boarding school labor, for example, and other examples we could think about as well. So third, I think that understanding the full history of indigenous slavery alongside of African slavery forces us to rethink the very foundations of settler colonialism in the US and understand US history in very specific ways, as well as the full range of injustices that indigenous people experienced. It's often said that the United States had two original sins. Perhaps you've heard this at some point in your life, enslaving Africans and stealing native lands. But I think that this project shows that we need to revise this. Indigenous people experience both having their land stolen as well as being enslaved. They experience both of these so-called original sins. Additionally, enslaving natives did the dual work of providing labor as well as clearing lands for other forms of settler colonial development, for farms and plantations, allowing farms and even in the American South, tobacco and cotton plantations over time to thrive. Enslaving natives destabilized tribes and communities, which strengthened settler colonial powers as well. So these are all important processes that need to be understood fully. So I want to transition for a little bit to show a few examples of the records that we're drawing from. So this is a draft of the new website that we're working on with an expanded search interface for the 7,000 and counting records that we have so far. This is not live, but we hope to go live next year sometime. But I wanted to give you a small window into the kinds of records we have. And the screenshots I'll be showing are from our experimental search, not the actual website that will be developed over time. So the first document here comes from 1614, when an English ship captain named Thomas Hunt kidnapped 24 Wampanoags and sold them as slaves in Spain off the coast of Cape Cod. And we know the names of one of them, Squanto or Tisquantum, because he escaped and made his way back to his homeland in New England, as it was later called, again. But note the date. I think this is really important. So 1614. This is before 1619, which is sort of the traditional origins of the start of African slavery in Virginia. It's also before 1620, when the Pilgrims first landed in New England. And I'm so appreciative of the work of Paula Peters and other indigenous scholars to really illuminate this history over time and the story of Tisquantum. The next document is from the Pequot War, fought here in New England in the 1630s, shortly after the founding of Boston. And this document here is from July 1637 and from the Journal of Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop. And it documents, within the sort of blue square there, documents English raids on the Pequot Indians, indigenous people, during the Pequot War in 1636, 1637. And it specifically says that the soldiers, English soldiers, hunted Pequot women and children and men out of swamps, captured 200 women and children, and sent them as slaves to Connecticut and Massachusetts. And we have documents of them arriving at the port of Boston, 1637. It also says that 17 Pequot captives were intended to be shipped to Bermuda, but instead were shipped to Providence Island, deep in the Spanish Caribbean, off the coast of what's now Nicaragua and Honduras. And we know from other records that these 17 Pequots were actually exchanged for enslaved Africans, who then were brought back and sold into slavery in Boston. Some of the first enslaved Africans arrive in Boston. The next document is from a self-emancipated or runaway slave ads. These were really common, actually, in colonial newspapers, starting in 1704 when the first newspapers were published, the first durable newspapers. They're really common when enslaved people ran away. The owners could pay for an advertisement to tell all readers of the newspaper to be on the lookout for this specific person, and they would describe them in great detail, all in an attempt to have them return, to get them back. And I just want to point out that this turned the average citizen into a slave catcher. You see at the very bottom it says all persons, right? It puts everyone on notice to bring them back and to not deal with them, which is really pernicious and damaging, obviously. But this document shows that in 1775, in the eve of the American Revolution, An enslaved native man named Charles ran away from his owner. And these kinds of newspaper ads give some insight into the people themselves, the enslaved people themselves, and now emancipated people, although admittedly filtered through the lens of the owners. So Charles is noted as being a 23-year-old native man with straight black hair, light complexion, had on a blue jacket, but also he had been branded on the cheeks with the initials of his owner, RT for Robert Temple. And again, these ads are really common. In a recent article I co-published, we showed that there was over 1,100 such advertisements in colonial newspapers over the course of 100 years between 1704 and 1804 that included and involved Indigenous people. So quite a large number all over the American colonies. One of the most inspiring set of documents that we have are freedom suits, where enslaved Indigenous people leveraged the court of law to secure their freedom based on having a free maternal Native ancestor. And these Native American freedom suits started to become more common starting in the 1770s up through the mid-19th century. And so this document here records the freedom suit of an Indigenous woman named Seville, who sued for her freedom in Louisiana in the early 19th century. And one of the great things about these documents, which we hope will be useful for people, is they list off several generations of a matriarchal sort of lineage, a lineage through the mother's side. And so the generations of family histories that are given can be really, really fruitful and useful. The final document I'll show you comes from California and shows one of the backdoor ways that Indigenous people were taken into slavery and unfreedom. This is a document that contains a series of Native individuals in California from 1861 during the Civil War who were forcibly indentured to white Americans for varying lengths of time, sometimes until the age of 35. And it represents the way in which Native American slavery, peonage, indenture became a huge business in the American Southwest and the West between 1850 and 1870, even after the American Civil War, as I said before. This has taken place, by the way, in California, which after 1850 was admitted into the US as a free state, but still had loopholes for ongoing indentures that were completely apart from any kind of parental permission or individual assent. They were indentures handed over and ordered by their local courts. So New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, all the same. And residents in these states, in these places, did not think that the 13th Amendment applied to their enslavement and keeping of Indigenous peoples, and so they just ignored the 13th Amendment. And so Congress, as I said, had to pass a separate act in 1867 that specifically prohibited these actions. And even that didn't really work, honestly. So in closing, I want to emphasize that this project is also concerned with the present and the future. We hope this is a project that not only tells this story, but showcases Native voices in the here and now, to tell wider public audiences that Indigenous people are still here. They are still telling their own stories and have something that we all need to hear on a continual basis. So for the rest of the time, I know Lori will introduce them, but then we want to turn over to our collaborators and representatives from the three tribes and hear from them in terms of this history, their own contemporary work with their nations, and so forth. So thank you very much.
We will take questions from people in the audience here tonight and from our people who are joining us online. All right, coming onto the stage now are our three other guests. I will introduce them in alphabetical order. As Sanskwa, or female leader of the Hassanamisco Nipmuc band, Cheryll Toney Holley advocates for economic and social justice in all aspects of her community, including producing and distributing healthy foods, creating and encouraging connections for Nipmuc artists, pursuing land-back opportunities, and promoting cultural education for Nipmucs of all ages, including language reclamation. Cheryll co-founded and currently serves on the board of the Nipmuc Indian Development Corporation, or NIDC, an Indigenous nonprofit dedicated to the well-being of all Nipmuc people and stewardship of the Nipmuc homelands. Cheryll served for 10 years on the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs and is the former director of the Hassanamisco Indian Museum, located on the tribe's Hassanamisco Reservation. A former nurse, she is one of the original architects of the Nipmuc Women's Health Coalition, the first organization in Massachusetts to advocate for culturally appropriate health care programs for Indigenous people. A member of the Worcester Black History Project, Cheryll is also a professional researcher, writer, and speaker, specializing in African American and Indigenous peoples of New England, a passion she shares by compiling genealogies and written family histories for descendants of New England's communities of color. A mom of 4 and grandmother of 8, she currently lives in Worcester, where generations of her family lived before her. Next, Alexis Moreis is a conservationist and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Wampanoag Tribe of Chappaquidick. Raised on Nopi, also known as the island of Martha's Vineyard, she attended Brown University and continues to live on Nopi and Chappaquidick as her Wampanoag family have for 12,000 years. Alexis' work focuses on land rematriation, environmental justice, Indigenous food sovereignty, and sustenance rights. She served as a consultant for the review process for Vineyard Wind, successfully designating Chappaquidick as a traditional cultural property. You can find Alexis leading Wampanoag cultural and tech programming for the Chappaquidick and Aquinnah tribal members. And finally, she's a community partner for Stolen Relations at Brown University and serves on the board of the Vineyard Conservation Society and the Conservation Law Foundation. Lorén M. Spears, enrolled Narragansett Tribal Nation citizen and executive director of Tomaquag Museum, holds a master's in education and received a Doctor of Humane Letters honoris causa in 2017 from the University of Rhode Island and Doctor of Education honoris causa from Roger Williams University in 2021. She is an author and artist and shares her cultural knowledge with the public through museum programs. Lorén has contributed to a variety of publications, including Dawnland Voices, an anthology of Indigenous writing of New England, Through Our Eyes, an Indigenous view of Mashapog Pond, From Slaves to Soldiers, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment in the American Revolution, and Repair, Sustainable Design Futures. Lorén co-edited a new edition of A Key into the Language of America by Roger Williams, and recently co-authored As We Have Always Done, Decolonizing the Tomaquag Museum's Collections Management Policy, which was published in Collections, a journal for museum and archive professionals. Under her leadership, Tomaquag Museum received the Institute of Museums and Library Services National Medal in 2016, and she has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors. Please join me in welcoming all of our guests.
All right, well, thank you to each one of you for being here. I just want to say publicly also thank you as well for your part in the Stolen Relations Project and for your patience with us and also collaboration and helping us think through these histories and these documents and this project in a way that hopefully will feel respectful and legible to a wider public and to your communities as well. I think of all the many ways that you've shaped this project over the years, including the name. If it was up to academics and to me, this would still be called the Database of Indigenous Slavery in America, like the world's worst name ever for this project. Instead, it is Stolen Relations because actually the pivot to that term helps us think beyond labor in terms of slavery, in terms of thinking about loss and people who are stolen. This is something that we were taught through this process, so thank you. I want to ask a series of questions, but I want to start with just something more general. I wonder if each of you could just take a few minutes to talk and to describe to folks online and in person here a bit about your own nation and community and the activities today. And so start with the present and thinking about presence in the states you're in the communities you're in, and the activities that each of you and your nations are undertaking. I don't know how we want to go just down the line, perhaps, unless we want to just popcorn, and whoever wants to go first is fine too.
Start with Cheryl. Yes, you want to know like what myself and my community is up to nowadays? Well, so much stuff. We're very much into, I guess, reclamation of our culture and land back processes. We're involved in a series of different land back activities. One includes a 181-acre farm in Athol that we should get back within a few months. And then there's several other activities. We have a big language reclamation program. We have a women's group. We have youth groups. We have all kinds of things. I mean, we're a sovereign nation. We have our own governance, our own laws, our own policies and procedures. We honor our elders and our ancestors. And yeah, we're busy working with the state of Massachusetts right now to have a more real, I guess you can say, relationship with them, because this is our home state. And I think that's about it.
Kwasan. Hello, everyone. I think I will speak 2 terms. 1 minute, I'm going to speak as a tribal citizen, and then I'll flip to my role as the executive director of Tomaquag Museum. So a couple of things that I think are monumental that have happened in our tribal community is the Rhode Island Historic Preservation, nope, I said that wrong. Rhode Island Historical Society recently gave land back to the tribe, and that included Queen's Fort and the historic site of the Great Swamp Memorial, and there were 2 other lesser-known sites that were also included in the return. So I think when we talk about land back, that was critical, and that was a partnership with the Narragansett Tribal Nation and the Rhode Island Historical Society. As the executive director of Tomaquag Museum, which is an independent nonprofit organization, Native-led, we're doing a lot of work that's intersecting with Native communities, and one of our biggest projects this year was the culmination of an intertribal Veterans Monument project that was just the groundbreaking and ribbon cutting. The ribbon cutting was this September, and it was really great to have all or most of the southern New England or the southern Northeast, if I decolonize my mouth, tribal nations represented there, celebrating or honoring the veterans who served in their sacrifices, those that were literally interred in the Rhode Island Veterans Cemetery, but then, of course, all of those across Turtle Island. I'm sure along the way we'll talk about many other projects, but I'll just end there.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Alexis. Currently, I agree with Cheryl. There's so much going on, and there's so much that has been going on. And I like to always start that way, saying that any work I'm doing is the collective work for many generations, and wouldn't be able to do any of this if it wasn't passed down. So nothing's been recreated. If anything, it's continued. So the Wampanoag Tribe of Chappaquidick, for those of you who don't know, it's Martha's Vineyard. It's a little island just off of it, so it's literally like a 1-minute ferry ride. And I like to remind people that dispossession of land started, way before Massachusetts Enfranchisement Indian Act, and 1668 on Chappaquidick, lands were being taken just as meadows. So there wasn't a documented Euro-American colonial home there until 1750. So already our Wampanoag community was having land stolen. And I think that the start of that really links so much to Indigenous enslavement and the stealing of our relations. And we're so connected to our homelands, so that's where a lot of the work right now is really focused. We're really focusing, I sit as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, we're really focusing on bringing an understanding that it can be up to the state, it could be up to, for me, it's Dukes County, it could be up to a private landowner, it could be up to a colonist family, hello to the Mayhews on the island, that let's have these conversations, and we all have an active role in returning lands. And I think that, is really the forefront for us. We don't actually own any of our lands on Chappaquidick, or today it's also part of Edgartown. And that makes it extremely difficult. So we, on the island, also are home to the Aquinnah Wampanoag, which is a tribe, the federally recognized tribe, along as Mashpee in the state of Massachusetts. But when you look at historically, there, if you want to start in the 1600s, which we did not, there were over 45,000 individuals under Wampanoag Nation, and that was 69 tribes. So that spanned, present day Massachusetts to Narragansett Bay and our neighbors. So, we're trying to really, deliver history, but also show what's going on right now. And, I hear a lot of commonalities that happen. I think you're going to hear that. You're going to hear about land back. You're going to hear about food sustenance. We're trying to ensure that in order to stay sovereign, that we have control over our traditional ecologies, over our education, our resources, our health, and we are a little isolated on the island. It does make it difficult, and so yeah, there's a lot going on, but yeah, and also just a plug for people interested, make sure when it comes to, here we sit in Boston and we're looking at renewable energy, we're being on the forefront of wind energy, but we need to make sure that that isn't at a cost, once again, in a colonial perspective to the Indigenous people in our state, and make sure that not only are those community voices are heard, but it's in action, and that mitigations are made that protect Wampanoag people. And that means land return, that means financial resources for communities to protect losses that we have. And that can look anything like paleo landforms, that can look like, we had to encourage anyone interested, but the cables, last thing I'll say, the cables that run just a mile from our shore on Chappaquidick, and the timing was during spawning, and so there's ways that we can have a reciprocal relationship around what that is going to look like, renewable energy for our state and country and beyond. Thanks.
Thank you. And I realize it was an unfair question, perhaps, because there's so much that each of you could say. But one of the great pleasures that I've experienced with this project is learning more about each of the individual nations and communities and tribes involved, and the richness of the present day activity and culture. And I think that if there's anything that I could hope that you'd walk away with tonight, is that sense of vibrancy and continuous presence in the present, defending rights and thinking in critical ways about the history, but also about the future as well. So maybe we'd shift a little bit to some of the histories that this project relates to. And so I'm just curious how you and your nations think about this deeper, longer history of settler colonialism, which exists up into the present, I know, but especially as it intertwines with the themes of the project in terms of coerced labor, enslavement, tribal destabilization, taking land, and so forth, these intertwined things. What role does enslavement play in the way that you view this history, the way that your nation views this history, et cetera? And I know another massive question, but there it is. We could start on the opposite end or somewhere else. Sure. It's up to you.
Okay, I'll hop in. So I think that when we think about enslavement and the sort of erasure of Indigenous people, part of that is through that process. If you looked at the slides that Lynn was showing earlier, often it just said an Indian man, an Indian girl, something of that nature. And that immediately was erasing nationhood. It was immediately displacing them from their community. And then the act of enslavement took the people away from their community and then dismantled their cultural knowledge through that by changing the way that they dress, the way that they eat, the way that they speak, all of the things, and just disconnecting them from the community. So it's not just, like, it's easy to say the community is disruptive, but you think about it in context of your own family and think about someone from your own family being taken away, a parent, for example, that can't now pass down traditional knowledge, family knowledge to you and the next generation. So I think when we're looking at enslavement within our communities, we're thinking about that disruption and the ulterior motive, which is the land and the resources of that land. And so conquest is all about the land. It's all about the land and the resources of the land. And unfortunately, the people were also part of that resource network. And that's all benefiting the systems of conquest, the power structures of conquest, and empowering or financially empowering the conqueror through those means. And it's really difficult to deal with these histories. I know Native people from this area that say there was no enslavement. They're looking at the words like indenture and saying, well, that's different. From my perspective as an educator, it's not different. You are forcibly removed from your family and community, and you're kept there for large periods of time, often to 35. And if you did infractions, then they could keep you longer. And there's lots of terminology around enslavement, whether that's slavery, whether it's indenture, whether it's, you're the house help, words like that kind of erase what it actually is and whether you can leave. I'm gonna leave you on one more thing. I can't ever leave out boarding, industrial, and religious schools. It's funny, I have 2 degrees in education, but I know that in our history, education was forced enslavement, and that our children were taken from us and stripped of everything they know about their culture and community, and forcibly enslaved. If you want to look something up, look up Haskell Indian Nations University and baby handcuffs, and it will pop right up from their 100th anniversary, where our children were literally tiny, tiny babies like my 5-year-old grandson, handcuffed to these places. And so that, to me, is the epitome of enslavement.
So often, a lot of the stories that we share, the linkage of land and enslavement are ongoing. And one story that we share within Wampanoag Nation is the, kidnapping and enslavement of Wampanoag, and this predates 1614. And he was taken from the island of Noapi, Martha's Vineyard, and Gorges was the enslaver. And 3 years as on show to the British, and what we often see, and the linkage to land, is how it calls to us to return. That it's almost, it's a sense of empowerment, but it's also the desperation to get back to what you have stewarded and cared for. And we speak about how Wampanoag really quickly picked up on that, the I don't know how to say it, but really what was the concern of the colonists was money and wealth and items. And so he tricked his captive, and told them that there was gold, that there was wealth, that there was riches, and that he could lead them back there. And so, a captain was arranged and off on that mission. And but it was, it took over 3 years for Wampanoag to make that voyage back. And upon reaching the island, Wampanoag family came out to, seemingly trade. That was the conversation. And Wampanoag was able to communicate with their Wampanoag community in Wampanoag, to that, a plan. And the next day they came back, and they came in what's documented as 20 Mishoons, and there was a fight. There was, shots and arrows and casualties on both sides. And so, I hear that weaved often when we're talking about Indigenous enslavement in our community, of ways that we were fighting back, and ways that it's an endurance, unfortunately, but I think that those are the only reasons that some of these stories are not one-sided, because that's often what we see, and that's something we talk about a lot within Stolen Relations is, how to decolonize and how to indigenize these stories, and who you're hearing them from, and the lens that it's, spoken from, because often, that's not what you get in an academic environment. Even in my experience, even as a Wampanoag in an academic environment, it's been very one-sided.
So, I guess to echo Lorén a little bit, I think in our community, looking at those patterns, so for Hassanamisco, we have, indentured children taken from their homes because they need to be raised properly, so-called, in an English household. And then when they become young adults, they're still indentured. And then they have children who are subsequently indentured, and then the grandchildren. So it's like generation after generation after generation. And it wasn't like a by accident or, just happened to happen. This was deliberate attempts to not only take our land, our culture, destabilize us, because they couldn't come in as good Christian people and just wipe us off the face of the earth without having programs, I suppose, like the attempt to Christianize us, to put us in pertinent things, to make us better, to make us more civilized, and all of the excuses, all of the history that you read from grammar school to graduate school about how this country was founded. It was all for money, for land, for resources. And the people just needed to be out of the way. They couldn't just always murder them outright. We couldn't start a war every single day or every single year. So indentured servitude, which is really enslavement, carried on, at least in my community, for generations on end.
Yeah, thank you. And it's one of the things that we have wrestled with this project is how widely to cast the net in terms of the different kinds of unfreedom, which maybe you're not familiar with that terminology, but it's sort of an academic way to sort of think about different ways that people were coerced in the past in terms of not just labor, but also ideology, forced to live with families, forced to stop speaking their language and stuff like this. So we have tried to take in a range of documents. It's not just strictly slavery as defined by scholars of slavery, but thinking through the experiences of Indigenous people in the past of coerced kinds of existences that might include indenture as well. So it's an expansion of the notion of the meaning of enslavement over time, which I think could be powerful, and it's thanks to the perspectives we have that helps us think through that. So I'm wondering if maybe each of you could describe your relationship and working with the Stolen Relations Project, and what role you see it potentially playing in terms of presenting stories and examples and documents to a wider public, but also what role it might play for your own communities in terms of tracing potentially ancestors and making connections through families and individuals that have sort of been buried in documents or otherwise really lost to history or erased in different kinds of ways.
So the thing that pops to my mind isn't anything what you just said, but it's really about healing. If we don't tell the truth in history, we can't heal from the trauma of history. And I feel like our communities can use it best for unpacking that historical and intergenerational trauma and using that as a means of history. We've pushed Lynn and all the academics there to decolonize the database. Some of those things are simple things like, they give gender things and us doing a decolonizing bubble that might talk about two-spiritedness, or it talks about just an Indian, quote unquote, girl or boy or man or woman, and then we talk about nationhood and what that means. So some of those things. But we wanted to even go beyond that. And as a Native American advisory, we pushed and we said, well, not only do we want those things that kind of decolonize this database that's very structured and rigid and academic in nature, we also want to respond to it. So we want to be able to have people from the Native community and or other scholars talk about their perspective on this history, whether through essays and writing of that sort, or art and representation in different kinds of ways, poetry, etc. And I think that's really important. I think it needs to become a living document, a living thing, this database that's not static and just for those that are using the information from a very academic perspective. Because I think from our communities, these are our people, these are our stories, and I think we want to tell those stories, but we want to use some of those things and find some of those real stories of real people, not just the Eurocentric name that someone was given, not just that they're an Indian girl or boy, but their story. And I think this database will help weave that, because some of these people might show up in the data over and over again. And then other researchers will find other documents and resources. And in our own community archives, we'll find documents and resources that will connect to the people so that we can sort of reclaim their narrative, breathe life back into their story, and not just let them be this data point on a database, and really acknowledge their experience, and, as Alexis was saying, the agency of people in fighting back, and reclaiming their own right to their freedom of self and culture and community. And so that's kind of how I think about that space and place and what I would like to see come out of it.
So Lorén stole my answer.
We good people think alike.
But I think for me and my community, I think the most important thing is the truth. Uncovering the truth. We need to know about these things. My youngest daughter asked me one time, why are you always, going on research trips and blah, 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 blah? Because those people deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be known. They're our ancestors. They're the people that caused us to be today. And they deserve that recognition.
I would agree with you both, as usual. I just like to name some names. What Stolen Relations has given also evidence for that agency, for the documentation of not only what Indigenous enslavement was, but where the history of our communities. And believe it's Jonathan Panu, or it was enslaved by Simon Mayhew. And if you know any history of some Wampanoags in Martha's Vineyard, Thomas Mayhew was our governor, purchased the land, and all these tales that just make no sense. Nobody sold him all the land. Nobody agreed to this. We have documents of Wampanoag families would just come back around after signing something and saying, okay, we're back, and we rested this area, and we're gonna have our our crop here, or we're going to visit an ancestor that might be buried here. And the settlers didn't understand that. They said, but you just signed this thing. And that's if they had you sign a thing. So honestly, I think that what's so scary is erasure. And still to this day, having not just, settler families, but having academics and perhaps people and grow up with say, that never happened. No. We didn't have slavery on Martha's Vineyard. No. We had workers, we had servants, no. It's enslavement. It was the erasure of our community. It was to dispossess our lands. It was to remove culture, to remove language. You know, we often talk about, you know, the commercialization of fishing, you know, even whaling. Whaling was cultural. It was a tradition. That was something passed down. It wasn't to go get sent away to make money because you're about to lose your home and you can't feed your family. That's what colonialism did. And so I think that that's really something that actively we can use, these kind of databases, and also, as Lorén was saying, you know, making it more our work and showing, you know, I think there's tribal partners that were trained to also input data and analyze, and, you know, I'm sure with the digitization and transcriptions, you know, so it's also something that gets people on the path, whether it's something they do one of their 3 jobs, but we're really engaging in this information. But yeah, I think that's really a big deal to be able to document. Also, briefly, you know, there's so many linkages with this project that I think really benefits not just historians, but Wampanoag, for myself, Wampanoag community on the island. Recently, the African American Heritage Trail got Edgartown Harbor designated, and it was for Indigenous enslavement. And the woman's name was Esther, who was enslaved, and the document, you know, it was a news article that documented how these sailors lost their enslaved person, and they said we bound her and we put her to, I think, something like a crane. They really said she was tied and kept on the ship, and she'd come from Boston. They were returning this enslaved person, Esther, and you know, Edgartown was one of the busiest harbors. It actually, I think, you'll have to fact check this, but the dates, but also often we're citing, saying around when Boston Harbor was very, you know, wealth, that Edgartown Harbor was seeing a lot of that wealth coming back around, which makes sense. You know, it's a coastal area, and trade was, you know, with whaling and trade of other kinds. So Esther escaped, and I have to credit Dr. Elaine Weintraub and Carrie Tankard, who did this work. And what I like to think about, and why I think the documentation is so important, is that how would Esther, an Indigenous woman in an area that wasn't her homeland, how did she escape? And if you know Edgartown Harbor, it's just feet from Chappaquidick. And so I often share this, saying that this is something documenting Wampanoag resistance to enslavement of Indigenous people, to enslavement, which we have documented, of African American people. And so that just really, to me, shows that we were working in community even then. And that's it is only, you know, on the island of Chappaquidick and Wampanoag people that could help a fellow Indigenous person escape in the middle of the night in the waters that it's actually a very rough area, and disappear. And I think that we, as Indigenous people, have been documented doing that for so long. So I'm proud to know that there's that linkage of the Underground Railroad and, you know, documenting Indigenous enslavement as well.
Thank you for those responses. I want to turn to something that Lorén referenced briefly, actually several of you did, which is the idea of decolonizing, using the database, using the project as a site of decolonizing documents, of sources, of ways of thinking, ways of approaching the past. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about that through 2 related questions. One is, why do you think most Americans don't know much about the history of Indigenous enslavement and also wider settler colonial practices that continue to the present? And maybe as a subset of that is, like, what does that tell us about both the archives and their nature and what they hide and obscure in the way that they erase indigeneity and Indigenous identity and presence, but also about the storytelling that we tell ourselves as a nation, and how Indigenous people and their presence and histories have been erased in that process as well. So that's a lot there. You can pick and choose which parts of that you want to respond to.
Well, you folks might not like hearing this, but I truly believe that the history taught in school, all the way up to, again, graduate school, is just a big marketing campaign. It is. It's a big marketing campaign. It's taking the story of what actually happened, the horror and the terror and the just plain wrongness, and making it glorious so that people celebrate it. What a great country we are, with this, with that, with the other thing, when in reality, if you uncover the truth, none of that is true. So that's why I think most Americans can't even conceive of that, because that's not what happened, right? It was Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims were hungry, and we fed them, we all sat at the table, and then we were friends forever, until we disappeared. We just vanished into thin air. But that's not the real true story. And that's why most Americans just don't, because we just keep perpetuating these myths, never ever getting to the actual truth. And then the second part had to do with archives and stuff. Oh, I had a long conversation with a few different people about this. So researchers, they go in and they're researching what they are interested in, right? What they like, looking for things from their perspective to explain their existence. They're not looking for my people in my land and my issues. They're looking for their own. So when you go into these archives, they're indexed for other people. They're not indexed for people like me or mine. So you're not going to find what I need to look for, because no one has looked for it. People have dismissed it. Even in the Massachusetts vital records thing, sometimes all the people of color on the last page where you didn't even look. So the archives are set up for the dominant culture. It's not set up for folks like me.
So I'm going to piggyback on that a bit, but I'm going to do it from a Rhode Island perspective. Roger Williams, that's the mythology. He's the hero of the state. The colony. He's founded religious freedom for this nation. He's the best friend to the Narragansett Nation. That's the myth that's perpetuated over and over and over again. The reality is he held Indigenous slaves. One of the biggest stories is right after King Philip's War, he ends up with a boy Indigenous slave, Indian, as they say, in the time period. And I think that it's true that there's all these founding mythological stories that they have to create a hero out of, whether that's, Christopher Columbus creating him a hero despite the atrocities and the enslavement that he perpetrated. I think one of the quotes in his own writings is on the island of Hispaniola is how great the people were, how they helped him unload the ship because it had come on a sandbar, and with 50 men, he could enslave them all. That was the mindset of a conquering power, that you go in, you're entitled to go into a new place and claim it for yourself because you have the political power, the economic power, the weaponry power, and you're totally entitled in your own mind that you should do so. And so I think that these narratives and what they're saying diminish Indigenous perspective of this conflict and wars and ideologies. And I think, just as Cheryll said, that the archives were written and created by the victor. And so they are slanted and focused from that perspective. And we really have to read a lot between the lines of what's happening on those documents. When someone's running away, from our perspective, they're fighting back, they're having agency, they're working to get back to their community. From the victor's perspective, they're losing their commodity, they're losing their property, their value from an economic standpoint, they're losing that labor. And I think that archives, when we talk about decolonizing them, right here, if you go up into the Levin Hall Leventhal map area. I know there was a decolonizing project a couple of years ago that some of my colleagues participated in, and talking about those early historical maps from an Indigenous perspective. And I think that's what we mean. We mean giving more voice. It doesn't mean taking away the colonial voice. It's there, steeped in the whole frame and creation of this nation. But pushing back, and when we were talking about land acknowledgements earlier and doing something, this is something people can do, is give voice to other people to some of these same stories and open up other people's minds that there's more than one way to look at this point in time in history. They're not necessarily wrong, they're just divergent. There's a point in time, we're all here right this minute, and depending on our life's experience and our perspective, we're taking in information based on that. We might come out of here and have this conversation and be like, oh, that's not what I got from this. So it's just human to have all these different points of view, but we often don't tell all the points of view. We tell one point of view, and that's the victor or conqueror's point of view, and not everyone else's.
Yeah, I think I'll keep it short. I think it's obviously designed to do exactly what it's done. And so that explanation of any, I don't actually believe anyone believes it doesn't exist or questions it in that way. I think that we've all been colonized, but also that grooming of normalizing for it to have monetary value, for it to silence the oppressed. And so, that's the reaction you see today, and I hope we see more activity of, everything we do often in our community is multi-generational. And I think that's absolutely the way it has to be. And so, by design, and I think that's almost a great question really to ask non-Indigenous community. I think that's really all I would contribute to that part.
I know that we're basically out of time. We want to turn to the audience in a minute, but I did want to end with one final question that hopefully can just be a 30-second response or so. But if there's one thing that you want non-Indigenous people who are here today or listening to know about your nation, your community, your history, past or present, what would one sort of nugget of takeaway be, if that's not too much to sort of ask? I just want to open up space for that if you have something.
I mean, I think you should be open to other perspectives and other people's experiences and lives, and that they're not like yours necessarily, and that yours is not always the predominant experience. There's other people here, and they've always been here, and so we don't want to be overlooked all the time. This is our land, our country, our world, and you're guests in it for the most part. Be open to us.
Ninawan Narragansett Namanakai Napituan Naman Yaheo, which means we are Narragansett, we are strong, and we are proud.
Another question you didn't get to, I'm going to add to this, was about trauma. And I think that at this point, for Wampanoag Tribe of Chappaquidick and many Indigenous people, really returning to our lands is necessary for everything that we're addressing. So I think that that's really our ask, is to educate yourself, is to see what privileges you have and how to share that privilege, and to not make extra effort for erasure or to discredit. I even would like to mention my grandmother, Eunice Rocker Moreis. She's 85. She still remains in her homelands. She's the namesake of a woman who had her children taken, and by my even in this conversation, I think we shy away from, like we said, what is enslavement. And I very much so think that by design, these methods of removal are forms of that. Removal of language, removal from land, removal from your traditional sovereign rights. You know, Indigenous people have the right to hunt, to fish, to forage. And these kind of, it should be beyond land acknowledgements. It's about access to our land so that we can decide how our nations move forward. And so, I want to follow in the footsteps of my grandmother and her namesake, and she fought the state, and she won her case, and she had her children returned. And, I think that we have been villainized to make it easier to erase us, and we're beyond exhausted. And I'm a newer generation of saying that, so it does bring fear in me. So I do hope, as even the people present or on the Zoom, that they continue to self-educate and meet community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we now will turn to Lori to moderate the Q&A as well. But please join me in thanking our panelists here.
We have two people who will have microphones if you want to put your hand up if you have a question here in the room. And you will speak your question. Everyone here will hear it, but I'm going to repeat it just for the benefit of people online. And people online will also be getting questions from them as well.
I just want, one of you mentioned Thanksgiving, and I wondered what you do or don't do on Thanksgiving, and what you think that people who are not Indigenous should do on Thanksgiving.
Just repeating that, the question is, what about Thanksgiving? What do the representatives here do or not do on Thanksgiving, and recommend for those who would be allies?
So first, we have 13 Thanksgivings throughout the year following our lunar calendar. So we celebrate Thanksgiving all year long, celebrating each and every harvest throughout the year. As far as the Americanized Thanksgiving, our actual harvest Thanksgiving was way back at the beginning of October when you finish the harvest, so they've got it all wrong there. But nonetheless, for me, I work at a Native museum. By the time we get to the American Thanksgiving, we're ready to drop because we're doing 4 and 5 programs for the public almost on a daily basis. So we're all exhausted. So I refuse to work on the American Thanksgiving weekend and stay home with my family and enjoy my grandson and my children and the rest of my extended family. But many people in my family over the years have also gone down to the National Day of Mourning down on the Cape to acknowledge. I know Tall Oak and Jim Frazier and a myriad of other elders from that generation were part of the original Day of Mourning in the 1970s to acknowledge the atrocities, the genocide, the land dispossession, the enslavement of our people, and the continued reverberations of conquest and colonization. So what I would say to you all is acknowledge that history while you're celebrating family and community on that day, to recognize that that holiday was created as a myth for this founding of this country. They needed a story, a mythological story, and if you do your own research, you'll find that that is true, that that was like a founding myth. It's not even like 100 years old yet, the Thanksgiving myth. So that would be my answer. Anyone else want to add a little something to that?
No, I mean, our harvest holiday was the end of September, so, yeah.
When you harvest.
Which the Wampanoags taught the Pilgrims. But I think there's a time for really acknowledging what sacrifice that wasn't a chosen sacrifice. We did not choose that interaction. But I would like to highlight something that I've been told by elders, which is that when settlers started coming with women and children, there was a different gauge of that interaction. and points of contact happened with in seeing that and what we would respect in the presence of women and children is not what settlers did. So I would ask of you today to think about, to think about the Indigenous communities, to think about the Wampanoag communities, think about, think about those sacrifices while you're with your family. And maybe you don't practice it. Maybe you do go to Day of Mourning, or maybe like my mom does, she writes notes for everybody that is welcomed around that time. We don't actually celebrate, but there's conversation. And I think that that's really a great place to start, is be uncomfortable, because it is uncomfortable.
Hi. Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much. I really enjoyed hearing each of you speak. My question is kind of open to everybody, but I was interested in how your own oral and traditional histories interacted with the histories of the archive, because as you mentioned, obviously the materials in the archive were created by the victors in this situation, and how does that reflect in your own histories? And Alexis has touched on a few particular names and stories, so I really appreciated that, but I wanted to hear if there were any other instances like that.
Question is how the documents and the other artifacts in the database align or don't or interact with the Indigenous knowledge and history that the Indigenous advisors bring to the project.
Well, I'm not sure if the archive, you're talking about the Stolen Relations Archive. I'm not sure if it has, it has, like she said, it has names, not maybe like first names, English names, sex and age. It doesn't really identify people. You have to do your own work to sort of correlate that to your own community.
The only thing I would say additionally is just that maybe the archive is reinforcing the oral history that we know. It wasn't necessarily, on occasion, it's a fuller story, but mostly it's just the known idea of this enslavement that took place, and maybe validating that. But as Linford quoted me earlier, also acknowledging that everyone was not enslaved in our communities. It wasn't a 100% enslavement kind of thing, but how it was insidiously woven into the fabric of conquest and colonization in many different forms of unfreedoms that were created. And one of the ones that wasn't really, I think Alexis might have touched on it a little bit, but not maybe fully, is the unfreedom of forced adoptions and forced, what's the other word? My brain just went on a fog. Foster care. And that was, thank you. That was very prevalent. And we've had some full circle moments within our community because of that. So if you don't know, the Indian Child Welfare Act happened in 1978. And there's a family within our community, more than one, that were forced. There was this forced foster care or adoption, taking our children from our homes and families and community, but also some that have come full circle and have reconnected with our communities and have been part of it. One particular family, the man who's now in like 60, and it's only been a few years that he's reconnected. He was born before 1978, along with 2 or 3 other siblings. And then there's 2 siblings that were born after 1978 that were on, tribal rolls and still within our community. And I think it's really important to speak to that unfreedom that was happening, because these were forcible acts. These were laws that were put into place to take our children from our families and communities.
I just want to say that's ongoing.
Which is why we have to protect Indian Child Welfare Act. They use 1 or 2 examples of when it didn't work out versus thousands upon thousands, if not millions, of times that it did work out in the positive proactiveness for our families and communities.
Hi. I don't like microphones. I was wanting to sort of expand on the archives or the connection between the, I don't know what you called it, your representatives for helping the archives. I'm sorry, I don't know the term, but I'm wondering, there's been a long history of archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, archivists coming in and saying, oh, we want to study you, we want to do this, we want to educate, and it never being from the lens of the tribe themselves or an indigenous lens. It's always taken and a little bit for their needs and their wants. And so I'm wondering, how did you decide, or what was the process to be a part of this? And what did you come in expecting? And, or have we turned a stone and this is a new age of archival research that I just don't know about?
The question is, broadly, for as long as there's been scholarship, scholars have said, we're going to study you Indigenous people. We already know what we want to know. And so it's been extractive, which is a word we've used before. Just tell me the thing I asked you that I need to know. So how do you feel like that is changing? And how do you maintain that change in this project? And what can we do to turn that if it's not turning enough already?
So I would say we push really hard. So as a museum, and we do a lot of collaboration and a lot of partnerships, but we talk about equity. Equity doesn't mean equality. It's not exactly the same, but both parties should be contributing and both parties should be benefiting. And we work really hard to ensure that it's just not an extractive experience. You know, the Native American advisory on this project deserves a lot of credit and should be represented in documentation, in reports, in awards, in things that are happening, because it's important and our voice is important. And I think, you know, the world is slowly changing, and I think that people like Linford Fisher and others that are doing this work are realizing the importance of having an advisory committee. That's best practices. When I do professional development with organizations that are doing this kind of work, I tell them, if you want to work with Native communities, you have to build relationship. It can't just be, you know, here's my book, here's my thing, what do you think? Give me an endorsement, because you're not going to get it. And in most cases, we'll hate it if you brought it to us when it's all done in the first place. And so I think it's about building that relationship. And by doing that, you're building layers of trust, because there's a lot of layers of not trust between academics and majority communities that are part of the conquest paradigm and have benefited from that paradigm. So I think that's really important. And I will say, it is tough. I will give one story. My mother, when she was young, she did the folk arts tour in Rhode Island, and this young woman got on the bus. She was a PhD student, and she kept going around. Every time my mother gave the tour, she was going around and she was scribbling furiously, and she turned all those scribbles, all my mother's words, into her PhD dissertation. And that's outrageous. That's extractive. She took all the intellectual knowledge of my mother and used that for her own work and gave my mother zero credit for that. And, you know, that was the 70s, and this is 2023. Hopefully we've turned a corner and that's not happening, and that people are giving credit where it's due and are truly collaborating on projects. When she was listing off all the book projects that I've been part of, that started at Tomaquag Museum because I said, you know, and my board said we wanted to have Indigenous voice, so I started collaborating on these academic projects. I think the first one was Dawnland Voices, an anthology of Indigenous writing in New England with Siobhan Senior from University of New Hampshire. And it gives Indigenous voice. The only time that professor's talking is in the introduction, and the rest of it is all Indigenous writing from all over New England, and that's important. It's giving agency to the community. It's a legitimate partnership. The 10 communities get little, she doesn't get the dividends from the book. She passes it back to the communities. That's doing the right thing. That's giving an equitable process.
I
Hi.
do want to say it is improving. It is.
There's also a page I'll plug for everyone on stolen relations of the tribal community partners. For Chappaquidick, our website is ChappaquidickWampanoagTribe.org. You got to put the tribe there because there's a lot of different sites. And on Instagram is Wampanoag Tribe of Chappaquidick. And I think that I know in the development subcommittee, we really were pushing, and I think just to answer the person earlier, there is some pushing, and I think it constantly happens because I think even when people have good intention, we're used to doing things in a certain way. And so really highlighting, like Lorén was saying about, because there's so much Indigenous work going on, and I think that sometimes it can be overlooked, and it's almost like, well, actually, there's an Indigenous person already doing this, so you should spotlight them instead of saying, oh, but I wanted to create this. Because if you're really meeting community, you would want to elevate that first before maybe something that only benefits yourself if you're not Indigenous.
I just want to say quickly, too, that we all on the project who are not Indigenous are learning in every day a million things, and I feel so inadequate at every turn. And that's why I said initially I'm so grateful for the patience, because we're learning how to do this and how to do this better. These patterns of habits and how we're trained die hard in a way. But I wanted to say, too, that the origins of these collaborations in 2019, advised by Ray Gold, who's executive director of Native American Indigenous Studies Initiative at Brown, she said, look, if you want to collaborate, you've got to go to tribal leadership. And so that's what we did. We wrote formal letters from Brown, from the project, and said, hey, we're doing this thing. It may not be of interest to you, and if not, that's fine. But if you want to have a conversation about it, we'd love to do that. And so that was the origins, and then tribal leadership appointed a representative from the 13 to 14 different nations we're working with. So it felt important to recognize, as I think several of you said, the sovereign entities and nations that these tribes represent, and to treat them with respect, and then also value their involvement through compensation. Which I think is really important too. So, but I just want to reaffirm, we're learning, we're trying, but it's hard work.
Hi, my name is Charles, and I want to first thank you. This has been a great evening, and the series has been mind-opening for me. I couldn't help but notice that on the rewards slide, there was a 30-pound reward. And it makes me wonder, well, was that a lot of money or a little, like, in other words, in the economy of the time? And I'm just sort of interested in the value, like, of the rewards and the price of when people were sold. How valuable was it? And it sort of gives, for me, a context of both the business side, but also, and the horror of it. So. Thank you. If you can, if you can't, it's okay. I just was sort of,
Yeah, no, there's a huge range. It's a really good question, and there's a huge range of rewards that are offered. Sometimes on the high end, I think 30 is on the high end. That would be, in some cases, close to a purchase price. There are a number that are on the super low end, like a shilling or a penny, which is like, dude, why'd you do that? You probably paid more for the advertisement than you did for the reward. Like, it makes no sense, right? And so it's almost like this, like, not really caring about getting the person back, but just like somehow out of spite or something, putting this person out there. So yeah, a student of mine for a class had done a study, an abbreviated study of a bunch of the different reward levels in these advertisements. It's really a fascinating way to gauge some of these things. Yeah. So.
We'll turn now to some questions that are coming in from our online guests.
So I will be asking the questions. I've been monitoring the chat, which has been very fruitful, and there's more questions than we have time for. But some background questions on percentage, population, et cetera. Is there an accepted estimate of what the Indigenous population may have been in the, we'll say, in North America at 1700, 1800, and then out of that, is there a sense of roughly how many Native peoples may have been enslaved? And I would mean that in the very broad sense that we've been talking, not just the strict sense of enslavement. And was there chattel slavery? Were children of Native mothers also automatically considered enslaved?
So that question is what roughly, is our idea of the population, the Indigenous population, the population of North America before 1492, and of that, what percent may have been enslaved, and then what was the prevalence of chattel slavery, which is if you are enslaved, any children who are born to you are also automatically born into slavery.
You want to handle the statistics?
Well, all good questions, and I wish I had really good answers as well. I think the question of the number of Indigenous people in North America at any given point in time is really challenging because there's not sort of comprehensive censuses, and actually the censuses we do have explicitly omit Indigenous people repeatedly over time in a couple different ways, both in terms of erasing them racially, but also omitting them in terms of their numbers if they're on reservations or other places or outside of the jurisdiction of the United States or England or whatever. But I wanted to say that in terms of percentages, we're not of enslaved populations. The percentage of people, Indigenous people who are enslaved, we don't know yet. I think we're early in this process of really tracking and documenting, as Alexis is saying. You think about another resource out there that everyone kind of has benefited from, even if you don't know about it, which is slavevoyages.org, which is enumerating the number of people coming from being forcibly brought from West Africa to the Americas over time. 10 to 12 million is the number people use. That took decades to compile by researchers looking at shipping returns and stuff like that. And we're just at the beginning, I think, in a way of understanding the full immensity of this. So even the numbers that I floated earlier, 2.5 to 5 million or 500,000 in the United States, they're very educated guesstimates, but I don't know that they are ones that at the moment I would sort of base in terms of percentages, but I certainly defer to ideas that you all have as well.
Yeah, so I don't have any answers to the big questions, but I just think about that in Verrazano's writings. He talked about when he came up Narragansett Bay, there was over 100,000 Indigenous people. And if you think of our numbers today, the Narragansett Nation is around 3,000 people. And, that is the shrinkage of our nation through genocide, germ warfare, dispossession, and diaspora in all different kinds of ways where they've just fled to other places and have been usurped into other communities, other Native communities, but other communities in general. And I think that the data is purposely hard to find because they were erasing us, and it was much easier to say there's less and less of us in order to justify the taking of more and more. So it's part of the whole conquest paradigm for that data not to be there. And so this is going to be a long process of gathering data, and over time, when it's in this database and students and academics alike are working with this data, they're going to be able to, over time, extrapolate out more information and validate, best guesses based on research and things that are out there now. And so I think that's really important. For me, though, the data isn't the most important part. It's really the stories that we're telling now and the stories we'll be able to continue to tell. And there was one story that I think didn't get talked about before that needs to. So we've been talking about agency and, if you will, reconciliation and healing. And one of the stories is out of St. David's Island in Bermuda. For the last 20 years, we've had this reconnection. And it is known, it's fact and documented, that they were taken, their ancestors were taken from here up and down the New England and mid-Atlantic coastline and taken to the islands, which, there were many islands in the Caribbean that people were taken to. But the one that we've had this connection to is Bermuda and the St. David's Island community that have proven not only orally and documented and genetically that they're from here, from the mainland and from our communities, and have been doing a reconnection for about 20 years. And it's so empowering and powerful because, when we go over there and visit there, people walk up to us on Bermuda, on some of the bigger islands, and automatically assume we're from St. David's because our genealogy is overcrossed, but we do have similarities in looks, which is really interesting over all those times. And their stories and histories overlap. Now, they're an intertribal community, so their stories aren't from one nation here. They're an amalgamation of nations, not only here on the mainland, but on the Caribbean indigenous peoples, as well as now today, the intersection of African enslaved peoples in there. They actually have a dance called the gumbe that represents those three different cultural knowledges and that history of intersectionality. But that whole community is made up of escaped slaves and then now their descendants, right? And I think that's really empowering, and that people were continuing to find their way to have agency and find their way to freedom in any way that they can.
Another question from the chat?
I'm going to end with this because it's actually 7:30 and the Boston Public Library actually shuts very, very soon. So I'm skipping a whole number of questions, and I apologize to the Zoom audience. But one question here from the AAHGS New England chapter. It's important for children to be proud of their roots. Within Indigenous cultures today, are there Indigenous peoples looking for heroes within their Indigenous past and present?
Question is that children need to have heroes within their own culture. How does that play out in your different experiences?
I guess it's the same thing where we want to tell their stories. We need to make sure that our descendants know what their ancestors did and how they survived and how they thrived and how they continued their culture and how we all exist today and how we will exist in the future.
Lynn Malerba, the U.S. Treasurer of the United States. Deb Haaland, the U.S. Secretary of the Interior. Ellison Tarzan Brown, Narragansett athlete that won the Boston Marathon not once, but twice. Need a statue, by the way, a monument in his honor. And there would be no Heartbreak Hill without him. And, the list goes on and on and on. I ended on that last one just because he's from our own community. Our children have heroes in their community. Frankly, they're sitting up here as well, where people in our communities out there doing things that give voice, and just like we're following in our elders' footsteps, our children are following in our footsteps, and we hope 7 generations beyond, they continue to do so, and that they see the hard work that the today community is doing to ensure their voice is heard, their culture is respected, that they're able to connect to their traditional ecological knowledge, and cultural ideologies, et cetera, that it's really important for them. You know, I'm a grandmother. I want my grandchild to be steeped in his cultural knowledge, and he is, because he's living that life. We're there with him. He's going to the ceremonies, he's going to the cultural gatherings, he's speaking the language, he is steeped in it. He might not be conscious of it, but it's all there. But just as when we were children, we weren't conscious of it either. But everything we know today stems from our parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles and those that came before us. And so we're blessed that we had that knowledge that's been passed down and that we can hopefully pass it forward to next generations.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I honestly think that even talking about how things are passed down it's very much active. It's something that is you're living every day. And I would say for sure, I always say for myself, my father, because the places that I know of my homelands are because of him. And then he would tell me it's because of my grandmother, and it would go on. And that's honestly, that is preservation. That is how we preserve our communities and empower one another. But absolutely, like Lorén and Cheryll was saying, you absolutely need to see Indigenous voices in decision-making spaces. And, you know, that's in every aspect. Right now, I work with a wonderful nurse, Nurse Nisa Duarte, and to see the change in the health center that she's creating as a young woman, it's really been remarkable. And we've been connecting what is, you know, traditionally what a tribal historic preservation officer would do, linking it with health and caring for all of generations and spending that time together. And I think that I honestly would say I have heroes in every spectrum of my age. So I very much hope that people are mentoring and reaching out, because we all deserve that, no matter how old we are, mentorship and care.
Everything we do is a form of resistance and a form of agency. And I think that that's so important in our communities. Every time we speak our language, every time we go to a ceremony, every time we do what you might call arts, but cultural expressions, everything that we do is a form of resistance from conquest and colonization. And we just keep fighting forward. We're still actively trying to ensure our individual cultural sovereignty, our food sovereignty and foodways, our tribal political and economic sovereignty, all of it. It's an everyday struggle, and we continue to fight for it.
And that's what a hero does, fight for its community.
What a great note for us to end on. Before you all head out and before they come around saying the library is closing, our website, historicbostons.org. You can go to our events page and see the next event coming up, I believe on November 30th, an online event. You will also soon be able to see a recording of this event. And you can go to many places online to begin engagement with any of the Indigenous tribes that you've heard representatives speak about tonight. So there are many ways for you to actively get involved, to go places, to meet people, to begin conversations. And we're so delighted that you joined us for a conversation tonight. Thank you.